Welcome to the Healthy Aging Pod. I'm Kelly Yee. You can follow me on Instagram at Kelly Yee Yoga or subscribe to my YouTube channel at Avatar Yoga. In partnership with EPC Canada, we are excited to bring you our Healthy Aging webcast series. Our guest today is Dr. Kelsey Harvey, a Postdoctoral Fellow and researcher at McMaster University. She has been a certified group exercise instructor since 2013 in Canada and the US, with specialization in working with older adults and individuals with Parkinson's disease. Her experience inspired her to investigate how and what group exercise instructors teach their clients, especially in the context of age. Welcome, Kelsey. Hello, everyone. Today, we're going to discuss group exercise. What does age have to do with it? With Dr. Kelsey Harvey. Welcome, Kelsey.
Thanks.
Thank you for being here. So congratulations on completing your PhD.
Thank you.
So based on your research in exercise instruction for older adults, embodied education, and in and exclusive physical cultures, can you provide us with some highlights from your research?
I looked at the ways that exercise instructors are trained and how that training plays out in their actual practice. So the way that it informs the group exercise environment and the relationships that they have. And I know it's a lot of words in that title, but the main focus was really on how can we create more inclusive physical cultures where older exercisers participate. And exercisers of any age, but my main lens was looking at older adults in particular and the exercise instructors who work with them.
Okay, and what is the most common thing that you found in your research that fitness instructors instruct to their clients?
In the training and curricula, and actually in talking to many exercise instructors and talking to the exercisers themselves, safety and wanting the exercises to work, so efficacy, were two really important pillars throughout all aspects of the study. And really, nobody wants to get injured when they're exercising, but there are risks to exercise, as we all know or have experienced. But as an instructor, you really want to make sure that you're not the one who's causing those injuries. So learning and training and becoming very competent in what you're doing to try to have the program be as safe as possible, but also at the same time to make sure that there's benefits and gains from that. And one of the things that my research highlighted was that sometimes those what is safe can undermine what works best, and sometimes what might work best for some bodies isn't safe for all bodies.
Right. I mean, as you know, I'm a group instructor, as a yoga instructor, and that is something that I'm always and constantly saying. And you know that I also specialize with older adults as well, and it's constantly saying, practice sort of safely, making sure that you're not feeling any pain, sort of having that self-awareness as they're moving through. And I know, as you are too, it's like we're all wanting to do this because we believe that, and we know that physical activity and exercise is beneficial and hopefully preventative, right, from ailments and all of these other things. But in the process, there's also the potential of risk of getting injured while you're in that practice.
It's all about balance.
Exactly. Do you believe that because you and I kind of have this specialty and we see that there's a need, but based on your research, do you believe that there should be specialized classes for older adults or specializations with like people living with certain ailments? Is there is there a benefit to this?
That is what really kind of sparked my research to begin with, and the questions that I asked, because there's been a lot of growth for these age-specific markets, so older adult fitness or seniors fitness, and more growth recently with certain condition-specific exercise groups. So I oversaw a exercise group for people who were living with Parkinson's disease. I know that there's programs in my area for people who have suffered a stroke or for people who have been diagnosed with COPD. So there's this huge range, and I do think that there's a place for those classes. They fulfill a need, and a lot of so what the literature and the background tells us is that these classes really grew out of identifying a need. So some older exercisers, and still today, feel that their needs aren't met in these general or mainstream classes that are ages 18 to 118, right? They're supposed to be meant for the whole population. And that's a tricky balance, as you mentioned before, as an exercise instructor. I think that's one of the things when I transitioned from exerciser to instructor that you don't really appreciate is how much instructors have to consider and what is going on. And there's a lot of diversity between the bodies of people of similar ages, a lot of diversity in people who are of the same age, but a lot of diversity from that 18 to 118. So I think that there's a lot of opportunities with specialized markets, but I don't necessarily think that that should be the answer to the problems. I think that having more inclusive exercise classes that are open to everybody, that are those general 18, all adults of all ages, that we do need to do a little bit better at making those classes inclusive of everybody, regardless of age or health. But that doesn't mean that there's not a place for, I'm all for having a lot of options that people can choose from. So, and part of the problem is also that the older adult specific classes, the trainings that I looked at, there was a lot of conflation of age and ability. So there was this assumption that because you're older, that you can't do certain things. Whereas my body in my late 30s, those things are better for my body, just knowing that the limitations that I have for various forms and reasons. And maybe that's why I personally have gravitated towards teaching those classes. But there are people who are in younger bodies who have abilities that aren't well served by some of these really high intensity classes. I know I would get injured very quickly in some of those classes. And there are older adults who don't need to have classes that are catered to what would be considered like a low ability or a low impact type class. People who are elite masters athletes, who one person that would participate in my study, they were involved with a running group and they were 80 and really excited because they were going to win a lot of medals at the Masters, and they were consistently beating me as I'm running with this running group. And there's nothing wrong with that, but to be trained as an instructor, I know that there's a lot of diversity, but for other instructors who maybe don't have experience working with older adults, to pigeonhole this 80-year-old into this lower level of ability when their ability is better than mine, it doesn't make any sense. So there's a little bit of work that needs to be done in terms of looking at what some of those classes mean. So just because it's a class for older adults doesn't mean that it has to be a modified program. And just because it's a modified program doesn't mean that it has to be for older adults.
Yes, I absolutely agree with you on this. And it likely is because you and I work with a variety of ages. And when I think about older adults, and as you know, with this webcast, it's like talking about healthy aging, and I'm actually talking about 30s, like 30s plus, right? Like, so when we are, we have this diverse group of age ranges and abilities, I completely agree with you that there are some that are in their 70s and 80s and the 30-year-olds can't keep up, right? Like, so Speaking to that, do you think that sometimes if we do this sort of older adults group exercise fitness, and we see this sort of all around now, that it can cause a little bit of discrimination, where you're speaking about this modification that happens, and modifications I am all for when we're teaching, right? To give people options. But does that just mean that it's only modified for the older adult group exercise programs?
There's a lot of different definitions, but I define, and the one that speaks most to me, defining ageism is discrimination based on age. And so a lot of people assume that ageism is only directed towards older adults. Well, when I went to an aquafit class for my research, I was told I was too young for the class. And so there is this reverse ageism, as some call it, but so there's a lot of problems with that. I call it age-based, like, identity politics, right? And the same with ableism. So this assumption that people in younger bodies are more able-bodied. And so that does become a problem. And so even going back to, I still love this idea of seniors fitness classes or older adult fitness. There's a lot of names out there for them. I think that there's definitely a place for those, but it still technically is discrimination based on age. So the local center where I live is 50 plus. I can't go there, and that's okay. Right? And it's just like, voting or drinking, there's age limits on those things. You can't drive until you're, I think, 16, or depends on where you live, right? So there's age-based criteria, and those are in place as a legal definition for a lot of programs and policies. And so they do have their function, but I don't think, so there was an example in the literature as well, where one study said, the instructor who was quoted in this study said, older folks, do the best you can, everybody else do this. So that's really over ageism. And fortunately, I didn't see too much of that in the people that I spoke to. It was a little less obvious, the forms of ageism that were in that I saw. And a lot of it had to do still around abilities, and how really we need to do better as instructors. So you mentioned modifying, right? And that is something that needs to be done at all levels of instruction. So as a general exercise instructor, it depends largely on the training and certification. So the trainings that I looked at, some of them were fantastic. One training said, every class you need to modify to be able to teach to an Olympic athlete, and then your retired aunt. And so there's that over ageism, right? Like the assumption that the retired aunt is going to have this lower end of ability in the class, which may or may not be the case, right? But then other programs, so one person I spoke to, she was an instructor, and she was paired with someone for an outdoor fitness summer program. And she had training in seniors fitness, and the emphasis on modification there is even greater. And that was something that I saw in my research as well. And she was paired with this other instructor who did not really know how to modify. And the quote was, a bus pulled up, there was 3 people who hadn't exercised in a very long time, and this bus of individuals with various developmental disabilities were at this class, and he had planned a boot camp, high intensity, running up and down hills, and she said he looked like deer in the headlights. He didn't know what to do. And that's where I think the industry could do a little bit better, is making sure that generalist practitioners, they're generals. So you're going to get everybody to your classes. Whereas if you're getting older adults only to your classes, I think there's more attention to that need to modify, but that's not necessarily emphasized in some trainings, not all. Some, like I said, are wonderful, but other trainings, um, what it does is it not only is a disservice for the instructors because they don't know how to handle those situations, but imagine how those exercisers felt not being able to feel successful in that class afterwards. And people aren't going to come back to a class like that, and that's not what we want. When people show up, we want them to enjoy it and to come back.
Right. That, yeah, because that's a tough situation, and it's kind of like a lose-lose situation because now everyone's just feeling almost insecure about everything, right? From the instruction to the clients. And one of the things that I find, and I don't know if this is always available to everybody, but to be able to get your clients to do intake forms before meeting with them. And I'm not sure what your thoughts are on this, but I find that that's very helpful because then I can go through, it's not even based on age, it's usually based on their ailments and like basically their capabilities. Like, are they fit essentially? Would they categorize themselves as like, how many activities do they do during the week kind of a thing? And so I find intake forms are really helpful because then you wouldn't, as the instructor, you would be less caught by surprise. And then you can cater that to your clients. And if for me, and I'm sure many of us as group instructors, we want to be successful and have our clients be successful. It's like if we knew that, like you said, that this group kind of came in and they had some inabilities to obviously do this hardcore boot camp. Maybe this person wasn't the right fit. So maybe that person would have said, hey, I'm not the right fit for this as an instructor. You guys might need to get somebody that's more specialized.
One thing that came out of my research was it depends so much on the employer or the circumstances that whether that screening or how that screening takes place. Mm-hmm. So some instructors, especially those who are self-employed or certain settings, certain circumstances, they do have some pre-screening in place. However, other gyms and fitness centers or community centers, they don't necessarily have that. There might be a waiver that everybody signs, but there's not pre-screening. Mm-hmm. And that's really hard as an instructor. And I've worked under those circumstances too, where it's open to everybody and anybody who shows up. And so you don't necessarily know that person A has a wrist injury or person B has a frozen shoulder or any of these sorts of things as you're teaching. So you're trying to modify quite broadly. And one of the answers that some of the seniors or older adult specific certifications had to this problem was we call it contraindications in the field. So some people, the jargon, but basically the big fancy word for an exercise that's really not appropriate for somebody's body. So it's something that could cause more harm than benefit to a certain individual. And some of the certifications that I looked at, they would say across the board, if you are of a certain age, you shouldn't do X, Y, Z. And that's a problem because I have worked with some older adults where, X was something that they needed to do so Parkinson's, for example. One of the contraindications, one of the moves that the certifications don't advise for with older adults is a trunk rotation. So if you're sitting up nice and tall, because it has to be, I always tell my classes, you don't want to rotate a curved, slouching spine. But that rotation stretch can cause some problems for people who have certain conditions. But for people with Parkinson's, they get a lot of rigidity in their core. And so stretching through the core, stretching through the chest, stretching through the back are all really important for them. So if you say, and this was something that always kind of, I guess, bothered me a little bit was if we're saying everybody above a certain age can't do this move, but they can do it. And I had exercisers who spoke to this. One said, I can touch my toes, but the instructor says not to do that in the class, but I do it every morning and it feels good. And she didn't understand why. And that's where my research, I really wanted to emphasize that teaching relationship between the instructor or as an exerciser, that self-awareness, knowing why, why this feels good, why you should or shouldn't do certain moves. And so like the individuals I worked with Parkinson's, and just because they were at risk, maybe because of age, not to do a certain movement, but the risk there of not doing those stretches was more and more rigidity and less range of motion. And so you get these conflicting messages based on certification and training. And to me, again, that played into this degree of ageism. So the idea was, if you're an instructor and you don't know who's in your class, better to be safe than sorry, which is a good approach. But it does mean, and that's the safe and easy approach, just by saying, okay, we can't do this, we can't do that. But in a lot of the classes I observed, people would say, if you have X, if you have osteoporosis, then don't do this, but join us for this. Or if you've had a hip replacement, keep doing side steps. Everybody else, let's do grade spines. And so they understood, okay, that doesn't apply to me. I haven't had a hip replacement, so I can do this. Or they would say, oh, maybe this isn't the best move for me if I have had this hip replacement. So it respects exercisers' abilities to make these decisions for what's best for their bodies. Does it feel good to touch the floor? Well, if you don't have this condition, then maybe that's still safe for you, right? So it comes back to establishing that relationship between exerciser. So it goes beyond, it's nice to know what's going on in somebody's body and what kind of problems they might have and with that screening. And there are ways to go around that too, by just establishing that relationship and having those conversations. But also, you don't always necessarily know. People sometimes don't put things down on the screening form, and they're like, oh, I didn't know you needed to know that. And so when you're teaching, a lot of the older exercisers that I interviewed for this really emphasized, I like when the instructor says, if you have this, do this. If you have this, don't do this, because they could transfer that to their other classes. Because other instructors they worked with maybe didn't have that knowledge. And so for them, it was empowering, and it helps them learn more about their body, not only how they experienced it, but why it was important to maybe do or avoid certain things.
In the next session, Dr. Harvey and I discuss the major differences between instructors that specialize in training with aging adults and ailments. Follow me on Instagram at Kelly Yoga to find out when the next video will be posted. Thanks for watching the Healthy Aging Pod.